Detailed videos on why the Americans entered the war already exist, and given that I have no background at all in anything to do with American history, then there is nothing of value I can add there. So instead, in my coverage of the United States, I am going to focus entirely on the war aims, to try and give it a unique edge. The one thing you need to understand about American foreign policy at this time was their level of isolation, which gave Britain's splendid isolation era a run for its money. Whereas Britain would be the leading global power overseeing diplomatic affairs, but trying to remain non-biased where it thought it could, the Americans were barely interested at all. The vast majority of their foreign policy team was far from experienced. The nation simply was not interested, and the people got most of their foreign policy news from British newspapers, as the American ones had very little to say on their own nation's global involvements. Many Americans were divided on their nation's future on the globe. Some argued that expansion went against American ideals of self-governance, whereas many believed a stronger America was required to keep those ideals alive. After gaining support from the press, the pro-imperialist faction ideologies began to win. The initial movements in the late 19th and early 20th centuries went as follows. Hawaii became a US territory, as they believed it's either they or the Japanese who take it, and the latter would serve as a major problem, being an easy way for the Japanese to carry out attacks on the American west coast. Hawaii would be followed by the establishment of Pacific bases, the development of a massive navy that can compete with rival powers, and the establishment of a canal, either in Nicaragua or Panama, for increased trade and naval power. They would later choose Panama. And of course, the rapid industrialization was also on the menu. It was around this pre-war period that the idea of liberal internationalism came into American policy. The process of American military intervention in a foreign nation to install a liberal, stable leader but loyal to the US. This began in Mexico, 1914. There was a revolution, and Americans in the country were under attack. Woodrow Wilson sent troops into the region and occupied Veracruz. Overall, this was an attempt by the US to intervene in a civil war, or general unstable scenario, with the justification of defence, but with the reality of installing a leader with similar ideals to them, for stability and to protect commercial trade routes with the newly growing industrial power that it would be able to then take advantage of. This was followed by similar moves with Haiti in 1915, the Dominican Republic 1916, Cuba 1917, Panama 1918, and even in the Russian Revolution between 1919 and 1920, and is still a strategy we see to this day. When war erupted in Europe, America remained neutral, realising that instead of losing men in the war, they could profit from it. They continued to invest heavily into the great powers, funding a share of the conflict. America joined the war due to a variety of reasons that will not be covered here today. But what did they push for at the Paris Conference? What were their aims for Europe? Luckily, we have Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which clearly show exactly what the Americans wanted to see out of the war. There's many ways to interpret these, many schools of thought. Some argue America pushed these points simply for peace, whereas others would look at them as benefiting America economically. I will go over each one of these points and add how it would have greatly benefited America, from the philosophy that just because it benefits America does not mean it cannot also be an attempt to secure peace. It is then up to you, of course, to decide whether these were purely peaceful and supportive, or ruthlessly opportunistic, or maybe a bit of both. 1. Open diplomacy between all powers of Europe. Any future national alliances and relations must be public, not only so that the people of that nation can involve themselves democratically in the process of foreign policy, but to prevent the creation of any hidden alliances in the future, something he believed was a major factor in the causing of the war. If the defensive alliances are really to be a deterrent for war, then they must be public, he believed. 2. Outside of territory waters were to be granted absolute freedom in peace and war. This was to allow trade to flourish, something very valuable to a rapidly industrializing America. 3. The removal of all possible economic barriers, again further boosting trade and therefore America's potential as an exporter at the time. 4. The reduction of armaments for the greater security of the world. This would result in many agreements, limiting the allowed production of weapons, the most famous of which being the Warship Naval Treaty that limited the production of battleships, battle cruisers and aircraft carriers by a ratio system, meaning no one power could get ahead and hold hegemony over all others, and likewise no arms race. Here's the ratios if you were curious. Japan felt ripped off by this deal. 5. An open-minded rethinking of colonialism, where the rights of the citizens must be considered alongside the rights claimed by the coloniser, lowering their power whilst potentially creating smaller, new former colonial states in which the US can do business with. Again, remember, I am intentionally giving a very anti-American view here, simply to counterweigh the very pro-peace, pro-American view these can come off as being at first glance. 6. The return of lost territories to Russia, or to newly formed states, and the involvement of the Allies in Russia to ensure the freest governance available for the Russian people. It then implied that when the Civil War is over, Russia would be welcome into the League of Nations, as long as it respected the independence of the newly created former Russian states, further securing peace, stability and the continuation of trade, even with the Bolsheviks, if they were willing to accept the terms, but if not, as it seemed, then a continuation of Entente involvement, fighting the Bolsheviks. 7. The evacuation and restoration of Belgium, followed by a guarantee of their future sovereignty, stability and therefore economic prosperity once again. 8. The return of Alsace-Lorraine to France. We now enter the phase of cultural border creation, where nations are designed around cultural borders and must be limited there in order to maintain peace and stability in Europe. 9. The same treatment to Italy. The Italians must be united. 10. The collapse of Austria-Hungary, and the people divided by their culture. 11. Romania, Serbia and Montenegro must have their borders redrawn for peace and stability, based on historical lines, and Serbia must get access to the Adriatic Sea. The attempt of this was the same as the last 3 points, although it did not fully work, as it did not include the rights of Slovenes and Croats, and many more cultures in this very complex area. The Turkish portions of the Ottoman Empire must remain independent and free, whilst the other parts should also be granted untroubled freedom. Further, the Dardanelles must be opened to all commercial ships. The clear theme here, peace, freedom and stability lead to trade, and trade is good for America. 13. An independent Poland for all Poles, with access to the sea. 14. All nations must join a new League of Nations, to focus on maintaining the peace and stability of the world, although, due to America's belief in isolationism, and that no Republicans were invited to the peace conference, and that there was a Republican majority in Congress, they went against Wilson's plan and therefore never joined the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson believed what he called peace without victory, basically a way for Germany to end the fighting, accept light demands, and pursue a non-humiliating path of peace going forwards. However, notes of this deal were sent out and smuggled into Germany. The Germans were not interested in such an offer, and still the German government forced very unfavourable terms upon Russia in 1918. This angered Wilson, and he lost his trust among the German people. Despite this, however, the Americans still viewed the Treaty of Versailles in its final form, when that eventually came round, as being very unfair against Germany, and would later show themselves as being heavily against the war reparations and humiliation clauses. Overall though, Wilson's diplomacy is believed to have shortened the war by at least several months, saving thousands of lives. His diplomatic efforts to limit the gains of the Entente helped keep Germany intact, and did manage to maintain peace for some time. The established Weimar government had no desire, unlike Hitler, to reignite the war. However, despite this, there were also mistakes made, particularly between the Balkan states and the outcome of Russia. Anyway, hope you enjoyed and learnt something. Leave a like if you did, and subscribe to get notified of the next one, which will be on why Portugal joined the war. And please share this video with anyone you think may be interested. It really helps me out. But for now, this has been the history of diplomacy.